All right. Well, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and kick things off today. I just want to welcome you all to another meet and greet with the experts. For those of you who don't know me, I am Kristen Bussey. I am with Mindy Dwinell's team in the TCDC, and Karen Clark and I have the opportunity to moderate this session today. So we are going to be switching gears a little bit to talk about gene editing as it relates to economic and reimbursement perspectives, as well as patient equity and patient access. So knowing the cost of gene editing therapy and what it is these days from the initial treatments that have been released so far, marketed so far, the big question is how are patients going to afford these treatments? So today we've gathered a group of panelists with us to introduce them, not in any particular order, but we have Dr. Manar Zaghlula, who is the Innovative Genomics Institute, or IGI's Public Impact Director, joining us today. We also have Shyam Patel, who is Associate Vice President of Patient Access, California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, or CIRM. And we also have Dr. Kevin Strauss, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Plowshare's Therapies LLC. So Plowshares develop durable treatments for severe pediatric rare diseases with urgent unmet medical needs. So in good company for sure with this group. Today we're going to kick things off. Manar has volunteered to start the conversation and kind of lay the stage for us on the topic, and then we have some questions we can go into after that. If folks in the audience don't have anything, we have a few planned as well, but certainly we'd like to keep this session as interactive as possible like we normally do, so certainly feel free to raise your hand. Karen will be monitoring the chat, so feel free to put information in the chat as well, whatever questions you might have. So Manar, are you able to, do you have slides? Do you want to share your screen? Take it away.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, I have a few slides.
No, we're having trouble hearing you. At least I am.
I can
Really?
hear him.
We
Me
can hear you,
too.
Manar.
Yeah. Okay.
I can hear.
Okay. I'll keep going. Kristen, if I don't know if I can fix anything from my end for you, but I'll just get us started. Really great to be here with this group. Appreciate the opportunity. I have a couple of slides. Some of you all may have seen some of them because if you were at the ASGCT SCGE session, I presented some of this, but I threw in a couple others just to set the stage a little bit for our conversation today. And yeah, let me get that started, and I'll probably breeze through some of them as well. Okay. All right. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes, we
Great.
can.
Looks good.
Excellent. All right. So I'll get us started. I'll try to keep this on the shorter side, and then we can dive into the questions because I think it will be an interesting conversation. So, of course, you all know that there's tremendous challenges with affordability and access for cell and gene therapies. People will argue all day long about why that is the case. But I think many of us agree that prices are simply high. Whether that is justified or not is a different question, but prices are really high. These are the most expensive drugs in our history, and have now, in terms of list prices, surpassed $4 million in the United States. And what that translates to is a lot of times restrictive coverage and access policies from payers. So there's been multiple analyses of coverage policies from both commercial and public payers in the United States on cell and gene therapies. And consistently, they've shown that more than half of health plans will restrict access to not the FDA label, but to something more restrictive, oftentimes the clinical trial eligibility criteria, which you all, of course, know are selected to give you a safety and a clinical or an efficacy readout, but not necessarily capture the entire population that could benefit from the therapy. And that, of course, is translating down into commercial success or failure, or, the mixed bag that we have on the gene therapy market, with developers pulling out of entire continents like Europe, completely abandoning, years of development and hundreds of millions of dollars, quite frankly, because there is competition. Sometimes patients aren't as excited about gene therapy depending on standard of care. We all know about some of the challenges actually getting these therapies into patient arms, just from a logistics perspective. And yeah, it's ultimately ending up in lower access, and a lot of questions of whether this space can live up to its promise, its scientific and medical promise. But I always like to, I don't know why oh, here we go. I always like to bring it back to this idea that we really don't have we really do have a moral obligation to figure out how to do this. And I really like this quote by Elizabeth Marab, a former Kenyan journalist who passed away from sickle cell disease. And she said the only thing more difficult than hearing that you have a disease for which there are no cures is to hear that you have a disease for which cures are available, but they're not available to you. And that's really where our work at IGI sort of is grounded, and where we have spent a good amount of time and effort and energy in trying to understand how can we make cell and gene therapies more accessible, both in the United States and around the world. And of course, there are many considerations for why, and many reasons for why cell and gene therapy access and affordability could be limited, many of which have nothing to do with the finances, but many of which do have to do with the finances, and I'll get a little bit into the reasons why. But ultimately, we are seeing high prices and then low access or denials or restrictions from payers. That's a very US-centric point of view. Of course, a lot of the rest of the world doesn't get any access to these therapies. And I think there are some really encouraging efforts around the globe to increase access, and some really good models that we can learn from. And that I'd be happy to talk about later as well. So really, from a financial perspective, the biopharma model is simply not optimized or not built for cell and gene therapies. It is a for-profit, venture capital-driven space that works really well for small molecule drugs, especially for chronic diseases. A lot of times, there's what I would differentiate between biological risk versus, say, regulatory risk, which is much higher on the cell and gene therapy side, where biological risk is maybe lower because you're really targeting a very specific genetic or molecular defect. But the high biological risk of small molecule drugs is used as a justification for the high cost of capital. The financiers of these therapies are expecting a sustained profit with repeat or continuous treatment. So a lot of times these are for chronic ailments, and you can expect some off-label use for some of these indications. Obviously some more than others, but think Ozempic or other GLP-1s. And then the idea that if you develop a new chemical entity, you can get exclusivity depending on what particular indication you've developed this therapy for, anywhere from 5, 3-ish to 7 years. That's giving you a leg up. And making competition more challenging, especially if you can patent around the chemical space. And then, of course, you can ensure patient access through large networks of providers and pharmacies that can give out these small molecule or sort of simpler therapies like monoclonal antibodies and things like that. Whereas on the cell and gene therapy side, there really is a misalignment because we're seeing low risk, which is not necessarily translating into a lower cost of capital, even though clinical stage cell and gene therapies have been estimated to be about 3 times more likely to receive FDA approval than sort of traditional small molecule drugs. Um, I will say there is, like I said, some regulatory risk, but I think that regulatory risk has come down significantly over the years as regulators, especially FDA and EMA, and PDMA, are learning how to evaluate these therapies and becoming more familiar with them. These are, of course, precision medicines that are intended to have durable, long-term impacts, and ideally, sort of a one and done kind of situation where there really isn't any chronic treatment, and that's causing a lot of issues also for payment and recouping of funds. Um, in terms of exclusivity, there really is, you can, skin this cat many different ways. And so there's really no exclusivity for the genetic target space. And so if you can find a different path to the same sort of clinical endpoint or outcome as we've seen in, sickle cell and gene therapies, then you have quite a bit of competition, even very, very early on. And that's changing the financial model or picture for a lot of these financial backers as well. And then, of course, these are very hard to administer in many cases, and may require qualified treatment centers and specialized staff, infrastructure, and complex wraparound services like fertility preservation treatment or um, uh, uh, oh my God, sorry, I'm totally blanking, but long-term follow-up is what I wanted to say. All right, so you know, Axis really relies on a complex interplay of factors. So, from regulations to manufacturing, which dictate, pricing in many ways, which in turn also dictate which organizational model you are trying to use to make this a commercial success, and how you think about sustainability. But pricing also dictates whether you get payer coverage and reimbursement at a reasonable rate, and whether you get payer coverage and reimbursement impacts whether your organization model is going to be successful and sustainable. And then, of course, leaves out, the entire conversation about global access. But like I said, love to have that conversation. And there's opportunities for lots of policy innovation, which I think we'll get into in the Q&A, but I won't belabor that point too much as I did in the ASGCT talk. All right. And then there's this other layer of sort of access for or consideration for access, especially in our field where we talk a lot about rare and ultra rare and even nano rare and of one diseases, which is prevalence. So the US FDA or the United States defines rare diseases as less than 200,000 patients. That definition can vary by geography, but it's usually some sort of definition for rare disease. But we really don't define lower prevalence rate in situations. Even though in an analysis of over 3,000 rare diseases, it's been found that 95% actually have a point prevalence of less than 1 in a million, which would translate to only around 330 or so patients in the US. And of course, we all know that there's only about 5% or so of rare diseases that have FDA-approved drugs. And there have been some proposed definitions of things like nanorare to sort of define a commercially not viable therapy. And some folks through and Lorem have proposed that we define that as less than 30 patients worldwide. So of course, disease prevalence also has enormous implications for things like clinical trial and what you can sort of absorb in terms of manufacturing costs, or then at the back end have to ask for in terms of pricing, and whether as a for-profit company you will move this forward. And so there really are, important considerations for business models as you think about commercialization. There have been obviously some successes with traditional venture-backed for-profit biotechs, and lots of innovation in the space, like with outcomes-based payment arrangements and things like that. But it's a mixed bag, and it really depends on, how successful is your therapy in terms of clinical outcomes and safety, and whether you can convince payers to actually pay that amount of money. Um, and so, at IGI, we set out to sort of reinvent the wheel in some ways, and try to figure out if we can develop a parallel roadmap to increase access and affordability of cell and gene therapies outside of the sort of traditional VC-backed for-profit model. Not to say that the VC-backed for-profit model doesn't work or we need to replace it altogether, but in some instances it does not work, and we do need to have an alternative and think about that. So we put together this task force, which I encourage you to take a look at if this is something that you're interested in. We published a perspective piece a couple of years ago now in Nature that summarizes some of the key findings from the task force, but we really thought about sort of pricing and access considerations, manufacturing innovation, but also regulatory innovation. I think there's been a lot of really exciting movement, for example, through plausible mechanism framework and platform technology designation. We discussed at length IP and licensing innovations, like leveraging access provisions in your licensing to make sure that patients actually can receive these therapies, regardless of where they're from, what they can pay. And then organization and funding models, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So we explored, a number of potential opportunities for innovative business models, including nonprofit, sort of government-backed models, but also public benefit corporation models. And there are advantages and disadvantages, of course, to all of these. But I would say that because it's it is a space that requires a large amount of sustained funding. We lean towards a public benefit corporation model or some sort of model that ensures that there is a balancing between some sort of public benefit or social purpose and the profit-making entity or profit-making philosophy behind the entity, and not relying solely on a nonprofit model because it has its own restrictions in the US, especially if you are an MRO and you have to sort of be involved in active research to some extent at all times, but you're also trying to commercialize therapy at the same time. That might create some really critical friction points in your pipeline. And so the Affordability Task Force recommended sort of mixing a little bit of models, but most importantly, having sort of either a nonprofit arm or some sort of legal document that mission locks a public benefit corporation so it cannot easily convert into a C-type corporation. Because that is, public benefit corporations at the end of the day are just another type of for-profit company. And so they, through a vote of the board, could easily migrate over to a traditional C-type model unless there is, some sort of governance structure on it to prevent it from doing that. And we also think that, if you mix models, you are able to leverage various capital sources like no-cost capital from government or philanthropy might be more accessible by nonprofits or academics, whereas you can probably make the pitch for or make a justification internally also for low to moderate cost capital if you're a public benefit corporation that intends to make some profit and be able to pay back your investors. And of course, we're seeing tons of really exciting change in this space and innovation. Kevin is here, so I'll have him talk about Plowshare therapies. But I think everybody on this call probably has heard of Rarity PBC, which is working to commercialize the ADA skid therapy that came out of Don Cohn's lab at UCLA and Claire Booth's lab at University College London. But then there is, the Orphan Therapeutics Accelerator that has come online maybe 2 years ago now, working to rescue some of the deprioritized clinical stage assets for ultra-rare conditions. And then, of course, Terrapiravolox's Alpida Therapeutics, which is a nonprofit model, and then Caring Cross and Vector Biomed, which is a really interesting and cool sort of partnership that is working to improve access to cell therapies in middle income countries. I would say their focus is right now. So they have an interesting arrangement with Brazil and I think Turkey now, and a couple other, and in conversations with a couple other places where they're ensuring that infrastructure is actually built in country, IPs transferred, and the workforce is sort of trained to enable therapeutic development in country, and then they get royalties off of everything sold, but they can significantly reduce the cost of manufacturing into therapies by sort of going out into the world where things are much, much cheaper than the US. And on that point, I'll maybe just say that, even to, across the border to our north, cell therapies can be made at 10 times less the cost than the price of what for-profit entities are charging. So the made in Canada CAR T model can make these cell therapies for about $50,000 US dollars per patient. All right. So of course there are pricing considerations, and I'll probably try and wrap up. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, we don't have to talk too much about pricing. I mean, I think just one thing to note that the price is set typically based on what we call value-based pricing rather than some sort of cost of manufacturing or labor anchored system. And so that's why we're really driving up these costs with, some successes, some failures, and some sort of middle of the road things. And then I will just talk about, yes, this is what I really wanted to get at, is some of the key coverage and reimbursement challenges. And that includes, the evidence. Payers are really, really sensitive to having a tremendous amount of clinical evidence to demonstrate that this is actually going to be robust and durable, especially if it's, intended to be a one-time therapy that costs, that has an upfront cost of multiple millions of dollars. They want to know how heterogeneous the outcomes are going to be. Is this always going to be, or, in most cases, going to be some sort of cure or, like really a silver bullet, like with SMA? Or are you going to have, a significant number of patients having to go back to standard of care? And if that's expensive, that's a significant consideration. Payer churn is one of the most critical challenges in the US, where US adults will oftentimes switch insurance plans because they're switching employers on average every 3 to 5 years. And so if payer A is asked to pay for a therapy, but then payer B reaps the benefits, that really does not work out for these oftentimes for-profit companies that are administering these health plans. And I think it's important for us all to sort of be aware that private payers really don't think about the overall long-term healthcare savings, even though we all like to make that pitch. At the end of the day, that's not what they look at, because they are not insuring these individuals over their entire long-term or their entire lifetime, unlike, say, a government-backed model like in the UK, where the government is actually responsible for the entirety of the lifetime of that patient, and so they can make other decisions on coverage. State Medicaid programs, so public payers have their own challenges trying to cover these therapies, especially in states where there might be a really high burden of something like sickle cell disease, but limited, a very limited budget and resources. And once we've started sort of talking about outcomes-based arrangement in the space, that was, a significant burden, and which is why CMMI sort of stepped in and tried to figure out if they can facilitate some of the administrative burden and the negotiations to go into that and bring some of the resources and expertise to negotiate these agreements. And then, of course, there's financial burden on providers as well. A lot of times, hospital will have to sit on these bills for a long time before getting reimbursed, if they get reimbursed at all. And then oftentimes reimbursement rates can actually be lower than the cost of the drug and treatment cost combined. And so they're making a net loss on administering these therapies. And, that may work out when it's a very small number of patients that are driving a loss because you can make it up otherwise, but not if we get sort of solid tumor CAR Ts widely available, or some sort of gene therapy for a more common neurologic disease. There is some payer innovation on that side. So there's a new public benefit corporation that came online called Aradigm Health, which I won't belabor that point. And I think I'll just skip this and say, that's all I had. Let's have a robust discussion, I think. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for setting the stage for us, Manar. Appreciate that. Before I jump into some of the questions that we've compiled on our end, I just wanted to give the attendees here a chance to offer up any questions they might have had while listening to the initial presentation here. So I'll just pause for a minute. I'm not seeing any hands raising. All right, so how about I just jump right into some of our questions. So Shyam, Kevin, maybe we turn these over to you for whoever wants to address them first. Going back to one of the initial points that was made about the financial burden and how it's not just the cost of one single thing, and the research and development is what we always hear about, but from a BLA financial burden perspective, could you maybe address what the full hidden cost of a BLA beyond the user fee itself? We understand, that's a significant fee, the user fee itself, but what other hidden costs are in there as these therapies and technologies are being developed? And from an academic perspective, who pays for these user fees? So I'll turn it over to Shyam. I think it looks like you're off mute there. If you want to address that.
Oh, hello. So I was generally off mute, but happy to answer this to a certain extent. Not sure, are we talking broadly about everything that goes into this? So with respect to BLA filings, to date, aside from some of the core blood aspects, when it comes to these types of therapies, an academic has not filed for the BLA. There's one instance of an academic licensing at the very end and then having that therapy still be manufactured in an academic setting, but it is marketed by a commercial entity. And that's for a really rare indication, and that's at Duke. But in terms of the cost, so there's going to be a lot of manufacturing and manufacturing process and analytical validation costs that are going to come at the very end there that become really expensive. In terms of the BLA filing itself, there is a hidden cost of actually having the data in a format that can be submitted to the FDA, and that can cost a significant amount of money, millions of dollars. I don't know if Terry's on from Elpida, but that's one of the folks that has been sort of keying in on that, is that just the amount of money you have to spend to get your data package in order to submit to the FDA is significant on top of the BLA filing cost itself. Now the user fee, there are certain waivers in place for small companies. The eligibility for that is also very complicated. And so it becomes a significant issue there. In terms of who bears the cost, usually, in the case of a biotech or a pharma, they are paying for all those costs as part of their fundraising. And on an academic side, it would have to be something where the institution would have to commit to that sort of a therapy being approved and marketed at that institution, and that's a whole different issue. That there's not very much experience with having been done that in the U.S. And so that would raise a whole host of questions and liabilities as well as cost structures that have to come into play if that were to happen.
Kevin, do you have anything to add from your perspective?
I do. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So I think all of these points that Shyam and Manar have brought up are extremely helpful and accurate. I come at it from a slightly different angle in terms of Plowshare Therapies' origin and sort of how we're set up. I will say that the costs of development, of commercial development, IND enabling studies, CMC, toxicology, IND submission, clinical trial, BLA submission, they are substantial. But to Manar's point, they're not nearly as high as many companies would want you to believe. They're typically, if you do it on a lean budget, for example, a systemic AAV9, they're typically 10% or lower than the numbers you hear quoted from industry, that it's 300 million, 500 million, $1 billion to develop these drugs. The real number for a rare disease is probably closer to 20 to 40 million dollars in all-in costs for high quality GMP manufacturing, GLP toxicology. The issue around packaging costs, data costs, it's a good point that Shyam made. It is something that can be avoided with anticipation of that problem. So, for example, one of the things that Plowshare Therapies has done is, in the years leading up to the development of this company, we have been collecting very disciplined natural history data and building external control cohorts that are already captured in those FDA-approved data packages. So the data is acquired from the beginning in full alignment with FDA expectations, so that by the time you get to a clinical trial and BLA, there is no additional data formatting. It's been happening all along. So a lot of times that data formatting is sort of retroactively trying to shoehorn or fit what is often fragmented and multivariable natural history data into some kind of a cohesive package. And that's difficult and it's expensive. One of the things that I think when Manar's slide went up of these various costs of drug development, I think it's important to say that whatever those costs are, they are absolutely dwarfed by the potential market profits at these market prices. So if we just take Zolgensma, for example, onasemnogene abeparvovec for SMA at $2.1 million a dose, that's over a $2 billion a year revenue stream for the company that holds that license. A single BLA submission costs a mere fraction of a percent of that annual revenue stream. So these are not the things that drive costs. The things that drive costs really, there's really two things that drive costs. It's the cost of capital. So there's no question that venture capital and return on investment is a major driver of market costs. And basically, kind of the oldest story of capitalism, which is that shareholders in public companies, whether they be B corporations, public benefit corporations, or C corporations, shareholders have an expectation, a legal expectation, that the company will maximize the profits for that share. So these drugs are priced at what the market will bear, and the companies have a responsibility under this current system to price them at that level. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but that's how it works. And if the companies price it under what the shareholders expect, they can be sued by their shareholders. So this is the big black cloud hanging over the whole industry, frankly. And it's just an incentive structure that really considers patients last. There's a lot of lip service. We all do it. We all say patients first all the time. Every patient matters. But that's not what the incentive structure says. If you follow the benefits of these therapies, the benefits are mostly economic in nature, and they don't flow to the patient. The benefits flow to shareholders, venture capitalists, universities, patent holders, and so that, as Manar said, that we're not going to fix that through expecting for-profit companies to just have goodwill. And I frankly, I don't know that nonprofits and foundations and grant structures can fill that gap. It's a massive financial gap to fill.
All right. Well, that gives a lot of food for thought. I mean, so if we don't have the model to address that affordability issue, so what other models are out there, and what types of ethical obligations are there to pass these incentives along? Like you said, we always talk about the patients first and getting these therapies out to treat patients who desperately need them. But then when it comes to the reality of the cost of them, how do we achieve what you're saying, as far as being able to change the capitalist nature of our healthcare system and pharma in our country?
Well, I mean, all I can tell you is, I'm not a business person. I'm a physician. I'm a pediatrician by training, practiced for 25 years. I can only tell you what we're doing, and we're sort of approaching it as an experiment, basically. We don't know if it's going to work. I'll say that at the very beginning. I'm not a big fan of sort of casting forth some grand scheme. We're just sort of working a problem with a particular method and seeing if it works. So we have sort of an unusual situation. So the Plowshare Therapies grew out of the Clinic for Special Children, which is a nonprofit, community-supported clinic for children with rare genetic disorders who predominantly come from the Old Order Amish and Mennonite communities of North America. And something to know about this community is that they are conscientious objectors to Social Security. So they actually are the only group of citizens in the US that are exempt from Social Security. They are, as a consequence of that, forbidden from accepting federal healthcare dollars or Medicaid or Medicare or Medicaid. And that conscientious objection status is based on a deeply held community ethic of caring for their own most vulnerable people. So in the Amish and Mennonite communities, they have a belief. This is a belief that's kind of rare these days, but they have a belief that wealth that comes to them as individuals does not belong to them. If they have the benefit of wealth, if they have the benefit of financial success, that they are obligated to distribute that among the most vulnerable people in their community. And that ethic has actually largely funded the Clinic for Special Children for 35 years. So most of our funding, virtually all of it, comes from charity auctions, anonymous gifts from members of the playing community. And so Plowshare is sort of built on this same idea. So the way it's set up is it's set up as 3 entities, 2 for-profit entities, and 1 nonprofit entity. Plowshare Therapies is an LLC. It's the operating company. We use community capital to develop rare disease therapies. We're now working on maple syrup urine disease. We have 3 other diseases in our pipeline. And the second company, Plowshare Holdings, is fully owned and operated by members of that community. So it's all Amish and Mennonite board members. They have a share structure, a unit structure, so that if they invest in Plowshare Therapies, if the company becomes profitable, they get their money back at 1% interest, and the unit class up front forfeits their future profit interest to the public charity, to the nonprofit, which is called Harvest of Compassion. So that is also a completely plain community owned and operated nonprofit. They are the recipients or the benefactors of any potential profits that come from the sale of those therapies in the future. And then the Harvest of Compassion funds access for not just Amish and Mennonite patients, but any patient who needs the therapy. They also fund research and development and pipeline programs. So this accomplishes 2 things that are important, 3 things. One is the people who stand to benefit from the therapy have skin in the game. They are the ones investing in creating the therapies. Our company is really just an instrument of their will, is how you can think about it. Through their equity investment, that same community comes to own the company and comes to essentially own and govern the use of the license. So it puts the control for the asset into the hands of the rare disease community. And the third thing is it safeguards structurally the use of those profits. It pre-commits those profits to a community benefit to continue to create new gene therapies and an access pipeline for patients with rare disease. So there is no venture capital. We don't accept venture capital. And as soon as you do that, you know, as Manar said, boards change, corporate structures change. You know, many venture capitalists do have expectations about how a company is governed, about the use of profits, and can really erode a public benefit mission very quickly. So I don't know if it will work. If it works, it could be a different kind of model, which is to essentially allow the patient community have more power to develop these therapies and actually be the ones who primarily reap the benefit of future sales and future success of the therapy. Incidentally, these same public charity, the same thing would align or would play out for something like a priority review voucher. So if Plowshare Therapies gets a PRV and sells that PRV, the large majority of that PRV will go straight into the public charity.
Okay. Thank you for
I think
sharing
there
that.
Yeah, so thank you, Kevin, for your perspective and for Manar's as well. You know, I think one of the things that is important here is to sort of recognize the total cost structure to get to an approved therapy, and then how those costs continue to scale upon approval. And so there's a lot of different business models, as Kevin has pointed out, and as Manar showed in his slide, of different PBCs, nonprofit structures, and all of that. And all of them are predicated on having a massive amount of capital infused into that company early on to get to approval, and then to figure it out from there. So, you know, as Kevin mentioned, he only mentioned the preclinical costs. And so to get to IND, it could cost $40 million for a single candidate. And then to do the trial is an additional tens of millions of dollars. And then when you have to think about the manufacturing process to get to a commercial manufacturing state, just the development and validation of that process runs tens and tens of millions of dollars. It could be 50 to $100 million just validating that process to get to BLA. Once you have the BLA, now you have to have not only that manufacturing process at the quality that it needs to be to deliver a commercial therapy, but you need to have all of the infrastructure needed and the resources needed to be delivered that therapy. So, for example, consider just on the concept of coverage and reimbursement. A company will have to negotiate with every single Medicaid and every single private insurer for their product. And can you imagine the amount of manpower as well as resources required to do something like that? On top of that, the compliance, regulatory compliance, the liability insurance, the manufacturing requirements all scale. So I mentioned earlier the example of Duke actually manufacturing a commercial therapy at its institution. Just in terms of the FTEs, to go from a phase one manufacturing process to that commercial manufacturing process, the FTEs just on the quality side was 10x an increase in just the FTEs for the quality side. So you can imagine that the costs scale across the board as you go toward clinical, late stage clinical, and then commercial. And so when you do all that for the types of therapies that we're talking about here, whether you have, one gene editing therapy for an ultra rare disease, and you put all that money in, and you're basically repeating that same process again for the next one, those are costs that have to be sustained by really a lot of capital. And when you put in that much capital, there needs to be an expectation of return on the other end that is going to make it worthwhile to continue to invest that much capital in that sort of a risky enterprise. So that's why you see the high drug prices right now for some of these therapies, because they have to recoup all those costs and to continue to be able to sustain the costs going forward. If you have a therapy like the ones that Manar mentioned, where you're treating 10 patients a year, maybe 20, 30 patients a year, you cannot price that at anything less than a few $1,000,000 for it to be even sustainable to be able to administer that therapy to those patients and make it available. Those are the types of things that we have to think about as we go forward here is that, how are we developing these therapies? How are we commercializing them? And then what is the actual model there in terms of commercializing them? And a lot of that is reducing the time and cost to get to market is going to help with making them more sustainable on the commercial side. And so, one major area for cell and gene therapies is the manufacturing side, as you all know. You could have right now, the FDA has been working with various different sponsors on how to right size some of the validation runs you have to do at the very end. These are the PPQ runs that you do. So this is to demonstrate that you can make your product at a commercial scale with the commercial quality requirements need to be in place. Normally, the industry has sort of set that as 3 runs because 3 is a good number. But to do 3 runs for a very rare disease gene therapy, you're creating so much product that you won't be able to even use that over the course of the lifetime of that product. And so maybe you do 1 run as part of your qualification, and you do the rest of the runs during the commercial stage of that therapy. So that's one way you could right size some of the requirements. The other side is some of what was being done by Fyodor and IGI and Danaher is to take a really close look at the CQAs and what is an appropriate level of quality based on empirical data. And so how do you go about establishing the appropriate purity of a product for safety and efficacy considerations and having empirical data to back that up? When you take that empirical data, you go to the FDA, you can make an argument as to why you should have a different level of quality for your product based on that data. And that doesn't necessarily have to scale with the number of patients. You still want the same level of quality, whether you're treating 1 patient or 10 patients. But now you have empirical data for why that purity level that you selected is going to be appropriate to demonstrate safety and efficacy in a patient. And those are the types of things that we kind of need to focus a little bit more on that upstream part. Is how do we get the manufacturing costs, the timelines to get to market, to get to IND down. And then on the commercial side, there's a lot of questions and a lot of different models that have been developed so far. But one of the things that Manar pointed out is that the whole healthcare system, not just the pharma side, but the entire healthcare system is dependent on chronic care. So one of the things I like to point out is that if you look at the revenue stream for any major academic institution, say Stanford, the UC, and whatnot, when you break it down, the majority of their revenue actually comes from their healthcare services. That is across the entire university system. And that just shows that how dependent we are on healthcare services, chronic healthcare services across the board. And so to try to take this sort of a gene therapy approach, which is the one-time treatment, and fit that into there is very difficult, especially when you scale that. And that's what Manar was pointing out earlier. Now, there are newer models out there. So if you take a look at the CMMI pilot that many of you are familiar with that is being done for sickle cell gene therapy, how is that structured? So, we can give you a little bit of notes on that, and, we can walk through that if you'd like. So there, what CMS did as part of their innovation unit was to enroll all the states who voluntarily wanted to enroll. They got 33 states enrolled. And they went and negotiated on behalf of those 33 states a value-based pricing scheme with the two sickle cell gene therapies. This is with Genetics, which used to be Bluebird Bio, as well as Vertex on those two. And so what that works out to be is a set of rebates that are given out on the full price of that therapy. And then there's a value-based rebate on the back end of that based on the outcome. So to walk through that, what happens is that you have let's just use Casgevy as an example. A patient on Medicaid in California is administered Casgevy. Now, there's going to be two guaranteed rebates on that bring that price down to a certain level. And then the patient's outcome is tracked over a number of years, at which point there's an outcome-based rebate if it does not pan out to what was agreed upon. And so the total cost is going to be one, the cost after the rebates, and then the final cost is the cost after the outcomes data has been factored in. So to make all that work, not only do you have to have the rebate structure in place, but you also have to have the outcomes tracking and that final rebate in place. And that's where a lot of the holdup with some of these newer value-based pricing, outcomes-based pricing comes into play, is that now the insurer has to be able to track the patient outcome and to be able to then get a rebate on that, which is an additional administrative burden that needs to be put into place. And they're going to do that for therapies where it's going to hit their bottom line, like sickle cell. But are they going to be willing to do that across a lot of very ultra rare diseases where they're tracking all manner of patients for all manner of outcomes? And that's the part where you have to think about whether it makes sense, right? So if you've got like 10 different rare disease therapies, they all have 10 different sort of outcomes you're tracking, and each one is maybe a few patients in your membership. And you got to track all of that. That's a lot of administrative element that needs to be put into place for that. And so we have to sort of consider, even with some of these more unique sort of pricing arrangements and outcome-based arrangements, whether administratively it makes sense for the payer to do that for the scale of the therapy and the scale of the patient population at play.
So going back to another point that Manar made, and Manar, maybe you want to speak to this. When it comes to that payment, what and the clinical trials that go into development. So what type of clinical and economic evidence are these payers looking for in these one-time high-cost gene editing therapies?
I can get us started, but I'm sure Kevin and Shyam have thoughts as well. Very robust data. Ideally, not on a surrogate endpoint is, I think, what the state of affairs is. I mean, payers have really balked at the idea of accelerated approvals, thinking that or claiming, I'm sure they know that it's not the case, but claiming that that cuts corners or is sort of approved based on pressure from patient groups without actually having a whole lot of merit to the therapy, which we all know is not the case. I think what we actually kind of need in this space, though, is for payers and regulators and the developer community, as well as academics, to talk early about what evidence base, is sort of sufficient to convince both payers and regulators of the safety and efficacy of a therapy. Because if you go through the entire pipeline, you've spent millions or tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars on the development, depending on the therapy, and then you end up not being able to get payment because it's an accelerated approval, or a lot of I think even now, as we think about plausible mechanism, and the point cannot be made often enough, plausible mechanism is not an approval pathway. It is a new framework to think about, clinical development or preclinical and clinical development. But, payers here cutting corners, payers here acceleration of a development pipeline that does not generate sufficient evidence to argue for coverage and reimbursement. And so I think we ought to have more conversations with payers in the room to understand what are their sort of key issues. What data do they want to see? At what stage? Is there a way to collaborate earlier with payers also to generate that evidence? Is there, real world evidence that can be collected, or are there long-term follow-up data points that should be reported that can, generate confidence in maybe an entire platform of that will yield additional therapies over time. So those are some initial thoughts, but Kevin, Shyam, anything to add there?
I don't know how to think like an insurance underwriter, but I would tell you that in general, what I've seen is that people who are reimbursing for healthcare are generally looking for the same kinds of robust outcomes that the FDA is looking for. Manar mentioned the surrogate endpoints. Those are typically not suitable for this kind of evidence. They care about how the patient survives, functions, or feels. You have to be able to demonstrate improvements in survival, demonstrate prevention of some significant disability, prevention of some measurable form of suffering, pain, disability, or demonstrate the defrayment of other significant unnecessary medical costs, reducing hospitalizations, reducing downstream surgeries, bone marrow transplants, et cetera. I mean, these are the kind of the big things that I would imagine underwriters are looking at. And sometimes they're easy to demonstrate for rare disease therapies, and sometimes they're not. So if you take the example of SMA is kind of it's kind of a perfect storm of all the right outcomes in terms of being able to show really robustly a change in ventilator-free survival, a change in developmental milestones. Children who could never sit are now walking and running, right? And saving immense downstream costs. So the cost of taking care of a fully disabled child on a home ventilator is upwards of $3 to $5 million over a lifetime of that child. And so, there it's an easy case to make. But if you take something like limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, which plays out over decades, and may or may not result in a wheelchair, may or may not result in a ventilator, the outcomes become a lot harder to lock in a way that is demonstrably clear for people who are reimbursing. So I think this is a big challenge. It probably requires some innovation at the regulatory level, and getting payers to kind of align with some of those innovations, but I don't have an easy answer for you, but that's kind of the patterns that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I think from across different payers, the main risk right now is durability. And so demonstrating durability, and that's a challenge for cell and gene therapies in particular, particularly genetic therapies, where, if you have an accelerated clinical development path where you might be doing one trial to get approval, it's hard to demonstrate, clear durability over that time frame. And as Manar and Kevin mentioned, if you have new endpoints, new biomarkers, all of that, typically what a developer is focused on is convincing the FDA on those novel endpoints or those novel biomarkers throughout the whole development life cycle. And then once you get it approved, or closer to when you're getting it approved, that's maybe when you might engage payers. And so I think Manar's point is really well made, which is that, if you're looking at a particular therapy and a set of endpoints that are different than what the payer generally sees from other therapies in that space, or the natural history of patients in that space, you need to be able to get them in on a conversation earlier as part of your clinical development plan to understand, so that they understand what you're measuring in your trial, what data you'll have, and are able to better process the data package when it comes to them. And as part of that, incorporating the patient perspective is really valid too. You can bring patient advocates and patients to the table in your conversations both with the FDA as well as with the payers as to what is important to them. And so that's an important part of building into your development plan, which is not only you're engaging with the FDA, but also engaging with the payers. The flip side of that is that, if you're developing your phase 2 trial, and you're looking at the appropriate endpoints there, are those endpoints going to generate evidence not only for FDA approval, but also for eventual reimbursement? And are you factoring in the endpoints that are going to be important to the payers? And so a lot of that is just sort of mapping out your plan very early on during clinical development as to what evidence you'll need and who you're going to need to convince along the way, not only for approval, but also for reimbursement. And putting all that in the context of an accelerated development plan that you have for cell and gene therapies, and the fact that you're going to be getting the approval with a very small trial, and how are you going to get enough data to convince regulators as well as the payers?
Yeah, the one thing those are great points. The one thing I just want to add to this conversation that's worth noting is payers are holding gene therapy to a higher standard of evidence than most other therapies that they pay for. So as an example, and this is tied in somewhat to the price. So if you price a therapy at $3 million, implicit in that price is that you're offering a cure, right? Or something close to a cure. And so that's what the payers are expecting to see. They don't have that same standard for a liver transplant, for example. So payers pay for a liver transplant up front. They don't wait to see if that liver rejects and you have to retransplant. They don't take the money back if the transplant's a failure, right? If a young sickle cell patient comes into the hospital with an acute chest crisis and ends up losing a lung or having a stroke during that hospitalization, the hospital still gets full price for that therapy, right? The hospital doesn't grade what they're going to pay based on the outcome of that patient. And if you apply this to gene therapy, if we give a young child with SMA a $2.1 million therapy, is that worth less if that child is able to walk but not run? Or if that child survives ventilator free but in a wheelchair? Does it only worth half of that? I think this is kind of a ridiculous standard that these gene therapies are being held to. And I do think it's linked to the fact that they're just so expensive that everybody has the expectation that they have to work perfectly, and they're not going to work perfectly. We're seeing that already.
I think it's also important to recognize that, from the patient perspective there, so they're also factoring in durability, because for many patients, this is what happened with a lot of the hemophilia candidates, was that you're looking at it and saying, if I take this therapy now, is this my best chance? And will there be a better gene therapy that comes down the road that has better durability? And will I miss out on that? So those are the types of considerations that also come in from the patient side, is that they're looking at durability as well. They're thinking about, well, is this the best drug for me at this particular time? Or will there be a better one based on the data available now?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think just to come back to sickle cell disease, I think the points that Shyam made, it's very complicated, right? To think about how you would value-based price something like sickle cell disease. But the elephant in the room is that the entire therapeutic development, the logistics of how those are administered, the centrality of major university centers in well-developed, well-resourced countries as being critical to those therapies and delivering them is completely mismatched with the epidemiology of the disease and the reality of the disease in the world as we know it. So if you take Lyfgenia and Casgevy as an example, in the roughly 18 months since those are commercialized, fewer than 200 sickle cell patients have received either one of them. That is compared to the 750,000 people born with sickle cell disease in the same period of time. So this is a drop in the ocean. That's 0.02% of the incident population that is getting access to those drugs. So, we can talk all day about innovation in reimbursement, but that's really not the big problem, right? We're sort of replicating the HIV story all over again. Like if we didn't learn from the HIV triple therapy story, or we developed triple therapy, it's extremely effective for controlling HIV. It controls maternal fetal transmission, which at the time was a huge problem in Africa and in many high burden countries. And it gets to, a fraction of a percent of the people who need it. Well, then what have we done? I mean, I think the sickle cell disease story is a story of triumph, and it's a story of embarrassment. It's shameful that we have this therapy and we can't give it to almost everybody who needs it.
Yeah, and it's a good point. There's layers of complexity there, right, as you mentioned. So first of all, we'll start with the pricing side and kind of work backwards from there. So we were reviewing the Medi-Cal budget so they had to carve out the pilot that they're participating in with CMS and show what the cost would be to the state of California for that. And if you look at it, post rebates, those therapies are going to cost the state of California roughly $800K per patient. So that's a significant drop from the list price. But they've only budgeted for 24 patients total for the next fiscal year to be part of that pilot. And as Kevin mentioned, it's a drop in the bucket. Now, if you think about the treatment journey for that sickle cell gene therapy, it's roughly a year and a half. And you're waiting months and months after that first harvest of the cells to get the therapy, and then a long follow-up post that. And one of the things that's been very highly publicized is the fact that for the sickle cell patient community, it's really hard to mobilize those cells and get enough of them to be able to generate the product. And this is playing out now on the commercial side. So where in the clinical trial, you might have had a very tightly controlled patient population, on the commercial side, the lot failures have increased quite a bit, and you have to do a lot more collections to be able to generate enough material to give the product. And so that's putting a huge strain on the whole system as well. And then you think about how the providers and the manufacturers have to educate the patients. And you have to walk them through the entire complexity, right? In terms of, yes, you're going to get a viral vector injected into your cells. You're going to have to do conditioning. You're going to have to come back repeatedly for follow-up. They're going to take your cells first and then give you the cells back in 6 months and all that. To explain all that complexity for this type of a gene therapy is very onerous. And for the patient to be able to absorb all that also takes a long time. And then you think about some other nuances that are in play there too. So just this weekend, I was talking to one of the genetics folks at a local sickle cell gene therapy event. And what he was mentioning to me was that there's a huge population of sickle cell patients in Nevada that cannot access this gene therapy because their state Medicaid won't pay for it. And they can drive a few hundred miles to get to a treatment center in California, but functionally, there's no way to pay for it. And so those types of limitations also come into play as you go forward. If we think about that for sickle cell disease, right, which, there's a significant burden, significant patient population, a significant incentive to make these therapies work. And now you want to, apply that to a whole bunch of ultra rare disease gene therapies that might have the same complexity. How do we make all that work? And so this is where really kind of thinking through all of those things early on is really important. And then making sure that you get all the stakeholders lined up, the treatment centers, which, as you know, takes a while, the providers and the payers and the patient population all aligned on that therapy.
Maybe I'll just add one point because I think the contrast between what Kevin said and what Shyam said, I think is really, really nicely sets up the issue in sickle cell, at least the ex vivo therapies. I probably wouldn't go as far as Kevin. I rarely disagree with Kevin. But I probably wouldn't go as far as to say it's a, total embarrassment. Because I do see the complexity in, just, mobilizing, recruiting patients, mobilizing their cells, all the things that Shyam just talked about in terms of just success and the logistics. But I think where we will really find out, and I unfortunately suspect we will see it, where we'll really find out whether these companies are going to ensure that patients actually have access to these therapies is when we have something like an in vivo sickle cell therapy, and it ends up being accessible to almost nobody, especially almost nobody in the high burden areas, because we are still pricing them at the value-based price, and not, at something that's affordable and tied to the true sort of cost of manufacturing and labor and all that, with some profit margin. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
unfortunately, I don't think. Yeah,
I was going to say, just
to
as a
finish that.
caveat, I said it's a embarrassment and a triumph. I think it's a triumph. I think it's a triumph for science, and certainly for the
Absolutely,
people
I
who
think
received it. It is. I think what I was trying to say there, and probably could have said better, is the solution is mismatched to the problem as it exists in the real world. So it's a landmark achievement in science and therapeutics. Make no mistake about it. I mean, it's effectively a cure for a horrible disease. But from the beginning, it could have been envisioned as a methodology that was completely mismatched with the reality of sickle cell disease in the world. That if you depended on a high technologically complicated, and as Shyam said, logistically complicated on multiple cell harvests, that relies heavily on deep university expertise and structure, is priced, completely out of the realm of reality for most sickle cell patients. Of course, it's not going to be a commercial success. Of course not. And I think that what happens is a lot of those considerations don't come into play at the early stages, as Shyam mentioned. I think having more intentionality about matching your methodology to the patient population, taking into account these factors of access, which Shyam mentioned. Access is not just about money. It's not just about your insurers. It's about where you live. It's about culture. Amish people and Mennonite people don't own cars. Philadelphia is 60 miles away. And before our clinic was located in a rural county in Lancaster County, those patients 60 miles from CHOP were dying of maple syrup urine disease simply because they couldn't get there. They couldn't make the 60-mile trip. And now imagine if you're in Uganda or Kenya or even, somewhere in the Smoky Mountains. These are very real barriers that if we work in the academic setting and in large university hospitals, we can, through no intention or no malintention, we can be completely blinded to them. And so I do think one of the challenges that we face is how do we export this knowledge and this expertise to more disadvantaged regions of the country and of the world. We have to stop assuming that everybody who gets to gene therapy has to have a train ticket or a plane ticket to Boston or Philadelphia or San Diego. And we have to figure out how to get past that. And I think Carrie Cross is doing serious work in that space. I really commend what they're doing. They are real champions of improving local manufacturing capacity and local expertise in low and middle income countries in being able to develop these therapies. That will certainly drive the costs down in those countries, in those territories. But it doesn't solve our payer problem here for sure.
I think there are, certain therapy developers that are being more intentional at the earlier stages. Karen and Becca have done more for the field in the last couple of years than most have in terms of really sort of pushing how do we get more efficient preclinical development and clinical development of multiple therapies. And then, on our side, in our own portfolio, in CIRM's portfolio, we have a small company that's at the IND enabling stage. They're developing a AAV gene therapy for pain associated with the cranial nerve. And they're being intentional about the fact that they want to make sure it's a local delivery of this therapy where it could be administered the same way that pain injections are administered to patients right now in a local pain injection clinic. And so taking that intentionality early on and thinking, well, look, if I want to make this accessible, I need to make sure that it's locally delivered, that it could be done in the same way the current treatments are done. And that's going to at least address those types of immediate patient access barriers. And the pricing will have to be something that's addressed down the road. But at least in this sense, how do we make these things accessible to patients, really thinking about how they're delivered, how they're developed, and ultimately, how they're administered to patients is going to be really important. To do that early on is really critical.
So we have about 10 minutes left. And so maybe the last question we could discuss here, because it was brought up a couple of times about when to talk to payers and how important it is to start that discussion early. So when is that? When in the clinical development, preclinical development, when do those discussions need to happen in order to capitalize on the ability then to move forward, knowing that, or having more assurance that payers will be willing to afford the price? I don't know who wants to take that first.
I don't know the answer to the question as far as payers are concerned. I would tell you that the first thing we did before we went to payers is we went to patients. So we spent about a year canvassing MSUD patients from around the country. And we asked them how much they paid out of pocket for their health care for their child. They collected their hospital bills. We determined that that insurance companies were billed an average of $5 million over the lifetime of the child for MSUD. We determined that families often incurred debt or payments in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in out-of-pocket costs for those children. And then we asked families what they would be willing to pay out of pocket for a gene therapy. And we kind of started there. And the number that we got back was surprisingly high, actually. And the average that families would be willing to pay out of pocket was about $500,000. for a gene therapy that would cure MSUD. You can create a sustainable business model on a cash payment of $500,000 or less for MSUD. Full GMP grade clinical lot to treat 120 patients is about $2.5 million. You can add $500,000 or $1 million for quality control certificates and comparability assays, and you're still well under $50,000 a patient in terms of cost of goods. So, I do think Shyam's point about the massive expense of quality control and comparability with with CMC or GMP manufacturing is real, but a lot of those payments are also a result of poor planning up front or leveraging risk up front. So what most companies will do is they'll have parallel programs. They're gambling that one of them is going to hit. They often use what we call HQ plasmid, a lower quality non-GMP plasmid, lower quality runs for their toxicology, for their phase 1 studies, and then they'll shift into a full GMP. They then incur massive expenses in comparability and quality control testing. Alternatively, you can invest in that high level of manufacturing right up front, which is what we're doing. We're paying for GMP plasmid and full GMP manufacturing from the very beginning of the program, starting with our pilot toxicology studies. So one internal reference standard, the first one we make, will be the same manufacturing product process through the entire phase 1 through 3 adaptive trial. And we developed a potency assay very early. These are small things that you can do that can massively streamline in terms of time and costs downstream. But big companies will be reluctant to do it because you have to have a lot of faith that your thing is going to work to do that. It's paying more upfront with the belief that you're going to succeed. But I think these can massively reduce your long-term costs, actually. So there's ways to do it that are cheaper. It didn't really answer your exact question, which is when to engage with payers. I think that partly depends on what you think your market price is going to be.
I'll maybe just add on the when to engage payers. I don't think we know, right? I don't think anybody has engaged them in a way that has been successful in terms of ensuring that ultimately they will cover if FDA approves the therapy. But I will say that it is earlier than we are now, doing now, and then I think there's a lot to be done in terms of education, payer education, because payers are not a monolith. They are not, one or two or three companies. It is, there is self-insured payers, there is the marketplace, there's Medicaid, there's Medicare, there is obviously, commercial payers. And so engaging them, explaining to them what is it that you are actually developing, who is going to benefit, what ultimately do you think your patient population is going to look like in terms of an FDA label, not just a clinical trial eligibility criterion. And then what do you think, of a reasonable price might be? Obviously, you're not going to have a very candid conversation with them of like, what are they willing to pay? But I think you can probably estimate based on their reactions of, okay, do you think durability is going to be something that is really, you're knocking it out of the park? Or are you going to see durable effects in maybe only 70% of your patient population? And do you have to adjust price in that other 30%? Do you have to have some sort of either a rebate, an outcomes-based arrangement? Do you maybe lower cost up front? Those are all things that I don't think we are exploring sufficiently at this stage with payers, and we should. And I believe there is a conversation that PJ is organizing later in the fall with payers to talk about, some cost recovery models or, paying for investigational drugs. But I think that's an opportunity for us as a developing community to ask them, when do you want to be engaged? What are some knowledge gaps? Because they're also not going to be able to keep up with, every new innovation, every potential new gene or cell therapy that's going to come online. And I think another thing that we haven't talked about at all is, what do we do once other countries have cheaper gene therapies or cell therapies, and payers could just, send them over there for a fraction of the cost? Is that actually a possibility? Are they thinking about that? Is that a way that we actually will lose our edge or lose our advantage in terms of just innovation and competitiveness globally? And I'm always curious to think about, what's biotech and biopharma thinking about that, because I think that is coming sooner than we all expect.
I'll just add that typically for a traditional drug development pathway, it's about 2 years before your BLA filing, where you would really start thinking about your pay engagement strategy, getting all your data in place and starting to engage the ones that you might need to over the course of that. But as part of CIRM's recent changes to our funding programs, and just as a reminder, we fund preclinical and clinical development of a large number of cell and gene therapies. We implemented access planning requirements starting at preclinical stage. So at the preclinical stage, our awardees are expected to do a lot of what Kevin mentioned, which is understanding the patient landscape, the provider landscape, and the payer landscape. Do you understand how similar drugs are reimbursed? Do you understand the nuances of the particular patient population that you're targeting, and the type of therapy that you're developing at that stage? And then as you get into clinical development, you're really factoring in how you're thinking about access planning and incorporating into your trial design, into your evidence package. Are you doing any health economic modeling? And then how are you going to engage the payers as you get later into your development and closer to approval? In those instances, it'll be really targeted, and it may depend entirely on your approach, right? And the nuances of your treatment, your endpoints, and so on. But generally speaking, that type of interaction with the payers is going to be as you get closer to BLA. But the planning for all that has to start at the preclinical stage to understand the entire landscape as you go forward there.
Okay. Well, that's going to have to do it today, so we'll leave it at that. Definitely appreciate your expertise and sharing it with us here today. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.